So do we have all of the pieces in place for coevolution between insects and plants to actually occur? That is to say, are there traits for both the insects and plants that confer a fitness advantage that also have a genetic basis and that are sensitive to selection by the insect or the plant? So let's take a look. I'm going to give you some examples, really simple ones here, just to illustrate the point, but there are many more. The important pieces of this are that plants have some defensive trait that exert selection on, that is, they impact growth or survival or reproduction or something like that, of the herbivorous insects. And insects have some way of overcoming, some offensive maneuver, if you will, to counter these plant defenses, and their ability to feed on the plants actually exert some kind of selection. And by selection, I mean, again, there's a fitness consequence for being fed upon by insects. Let's just take this completely hypothetical example here, where we make a few assumptions just to illustrate the point. One is that there's some genetic variation here in a trait, and this trait is trichomes, that is the hairy structures on the leaves of plants that can damage insects, especially soft-bodied ones, that the trichomes can reduce insect damage, so there's a fitness advantage for plants that have this particular trait, that if they don't have it, that insect herbivory reduces plant fitness, they're able to produce fewer offspring relative to the ones that have that particular trait, and that this trait of defense, trichomes in this particular instance, is heritable. That is, there's a genetic basis for it. It's not just environmentally driven. In some environments they have it, in some environments they don't, but there's a genetic basis. And the important reason for that is that that trait then is passed on to the offspring that will also have that trait. At least the ones that survive will have that particular trait. So in this hypothetical example, if this particular plant has a genotype, has genes in it that code for that spiny trait, the hairiness trait, they can ward off those insect herbivores, and they produce more seeds than the plants that don't have them, or they have low quantities of them. And these produce fewer amount of seeds because the herbivores can chomp all over them, and they don't chomp on these guys. It is a straight mathematical outcome that if plants that have these traits are mixed into a population of plants that have these traits here, high trichomes versus low trichomes, and that there is a selective agent, such as these herbivores, that selectively makes these less fit, that is, makes them reproduce less than these here, it is just a statistical matter of time between these traits here that confer that resistance will become fixed in the population. They just will outcompete, those genes will outcompete these, for these plants, will outcompete those for these plants here. So that's the essence of the genetic basis for these particular traits. So is there any evidence of this? And the short answer is yes, there's plenty of evidence for this. And I'll give you a couple of really simple ones. This one is from this little mustard here, Arabidopsis thaliana. There are a series of plant genotypes. So again, this means that you have plants that have these unique genetic makeups. Some of these here suffer very little herbivory from insects, whereas others suffer a lot. And the ones that suffer very little herbivory have high reproductive output, number of seeds per plant, for example, whereas those that suffer high herbivory have a low reproductive output. And if these were all in a single population and these herbivores were chomping away, eventually these would be the only genotypes that you would find there compared to these, all else being equal. So again, these are the highly defended ones, these are the poorly defended ones. There is a genetic basis for traits that confer resistance to herbivores. So this example here shows that there's genetic resistance for resistance to herbivores, and that increased fitness in insect-resistant genotypes. And again, I could give you lots of examples that show that plants have these variable genetic traits that confer resistance. to herbivores. The flip side is actually also true, and I already talked a little bit about that in the examples in the macroevolutionary part. Here's an example that Anurag Agrawal did, where he took spider mites. These are generalist herbivores. They're a very nice study organism because they produce generations very rapidly from egg to adult in just a little over a week, depending on the temperature. And you can rear these on a variety of different plants. And he did it here on either cotton, on the leaves of cotton, not on the bolls of cotton, or on cucumbers. And he kept them on those particular plants for a long period of time. And each one of these bars is a different family. That is, they were all started with the same mother, and they were maintained on these for several months. And what you can see here is that over time, the line that was selected on cotton eventually had a series of genotypes that became quite able to reproduce on cotton. Not all of them, some of them struggled, but some of them actually did quite well. When you took those that developed on cotton very well and you put them onto cucumber, they didn't do as well. Right here. And the same was true, or the converse was true, for those that were reared on cucumber. There were some lines here that did very well, but when you took these and you put them onto cotton, they didn't do quite as well. And it looks like actually this trait seems to be a little more selectable in the direction of cotton than it is in the direction of cucumber. The strength of response, the variability in response seems to be a little more pronounced on the cotton side. And this is just an illustration of what happens when you give insects enough time to deal with and to evolve resistance against those traits that otherwise would have been harmful to them, or would have been slowing down their development. Or now the mechanisms for this is not entirely clear, but it's just an illustration of the ability of plants to adapt to their plants. Here's another really wonderful example that's very well illustrated the ability of plants and insects to respond to each other evolutionarily in a very short amount of time. And this again came from the lab of Dr. May Berenbaum at the University of Illinois. And she basically used invasive plants as an example of a natural experiment, where the impact of the herbivorous insect was observed over long periods of time as the plant was either exposed with the herbivores or without the herbivores. Let me give you this example here. So let's imagine this plant here in Europe has been under herbivory from some of the native herbivores that it has, like this butterfly here. It's not unusual for these plants to be transported around the world, especially as trade in the early 1600s was starting. People would pick up their favorite plants and move them with them to start gardens and to make sure they had food where they got to where they were going. Particularly European colonists, as they moved from Europe into the New World here, into the Americas. The hypothesis that is often put forward is that in the absence of co-evolved herbivores, there should be selection for reduced plant defenses in this new range where this plant is now finding itself devoid of any herbivores on it. And the basic idea here is that that defensive chemistry, that the maintenance, the development of defensive chemistry is expensive, is metabolically expensive. And in the presence of herbivore, it makes sense to have these because otherwise you'd be losing a lot of tissue, but there's a cost to actually doing that. In the absence of herbivores, there's really no fitness advantage compared to those genotypes that don't have that trait, or that have lower amounts of that trait, which then can become more common because they can put more of their energy towards reproduction, for example, without fear without repercussions in being eaten by herbivores. So this is exactly the situation that happened in the early 1600s as European colonists brought with them a source of food, the wild parsnip that was used as a root crop, and now exists along roadsides and in old fields in pretty much the entirety of the United States. And in fact, here in Wisconsin, it's quite an invasive weed that you often see on the roadsides in late summer. the big yellow flowers. And as you may remember from the previous little mini lecture, these plants also contain linear foranocoumarins, which are the ones that are phototoxic, that if you get them on your skin will actually cause these nasty blisterings because of the cross-linking of those compounds with DNA, causing cell death and all kinds of other nasty things that can take weeks to overcome. Now, what's interesting is that virtually no North American insects colonized the parsnip early on. However, in the late 1800s, in 1869 to be precise, the parsnip webworm, this little ecophorid caterpillar, little moth, Deprecaria pastinacella, was accidentally introduced from Europe, and it rapidly spread throughout North America. The neat thing about these is they actually spin a little web. They're called a webworm because they actually will grab the florets of the umbel. They will bind them together with a little bit of silk. They will actually shade themselves inside of this so that less UV light gets in, and that damaging cross-linking reaction actually is not as likely to occur. And they will feed on the seeds inside of the umbel, causing significant damage to the plants. So here's the situation, just to recap. Before the colonization, these two species were interacting with each other in Europe, the parsnip and the parsnip webworm, and therefore there was selection for much higher foranocoumarin concentrations in the parsnip in these areas. Plants needed to defend themselves from the herbivores. There was a period of release from herbivory in the new environment when the plant was brought to North America. And there was about 260 years where there was basically no herbivory of these plants. And because these plants are biennial, they actually flower every 2 years. This is about 120 generations of relaxed selection pressure for these defensive traits because there were no herbivores. And then after the 1860s, the herbivore was reintroduced. And since then, we've had about 70 generations, at least when this study was done, 70 generations of herbivory of the plant in the New World. And so what you would expect for plant defenses is that in the European range, there would always be kind of a consistently high level of foranocoumarins, whereas in the introduced range, originally the plants that got here had a high level of them. Without the herbivores, the plant defenses would go down, again, because these defenses are costly, and they would have to, and the genotypes that didn't have as much high allocation to defense would become more dominant. And yet, with the reintroduction of the Deprecaria here, you would expect selection for that particular trait. So what did they actually find? Now, the neat thing about this study is that May and her students actually went to herbarium records that went back quite a ways. And what they were able to find were evidence from botanists who would collect these plants and press them and then store them in museums, is that indeed what they found was that indeed early on in the 1840s, 1860s, there was never any evidence of any webworm damage on the plants, and that after about the 1860s here, it started to become much more common to find them. And so this is again evidence that these little webworms had been pretty much free, and this again is evidence that parsnip had pretty much been free of herbivory prior to the 1800s here. So what happens to these plants afterwards? So let's just focus a little bit. Let's focus. So what happens to these plants? Along here, along the y-axis here, is the concentration of these different foranocoumarins here that are present. And what you find is that during this period of low herbivory, remember they had been here since the 1600s without any herbivores, the concentration of these chemicals were significantly lower in these plants compared to after the webworms were actually found. That showed this ever increasing amount of, the that show this ever-increasing amount of phyranocoumarins in the plants after the reintroduction of the parsnip webworm. This line here actually is the This line here is actually the concentration of these chemicals from the European populations that had been continuing to experience herbivory from the webworms. So this is consistent with the hypothesis that in fact the herbivores were able to select from these low levels of defense back to these higher levels of defense. And in fact, it looks like they seem to overshoot a little bit of the European levels there. So this is an example in short ecological time, really, only a few hundred generations of interaction, that shows that the relationship between the herbivore and the plant is able to select for higher or lower amounts depending on whether the herbivore was there or not.